In Riverside, Indiana, a determined historian was about to uncover the darkest secret her hometown had ever buried. What started as a simple restoration project took a chilling turn when she came face to face with a cell door chained shut from the outside and symbols carved in warning all around it. Margaret Maggie. Rowe wasn't your typical small-town buyer. For years, she had spent her life documenting forgotten histories, known for her relentless pursuit of truth, no matter how uncomfortable. A single mother returning to her roots, she saw opportunity where others saw only decay. When she bought the abandoned jailhouse for $1 at a county auction, she had no idea she was walking into a decades-old cover-up. The whispered warnings from neighbors, the threats from the sheriff, the desperate offers from wealthy businessmen, Maggie ignored them all. Driven by one question, why would anyone seal a cell so completely that even authorities refused to open it? What began as curiosity about strange symbols carved into prison walls would become a revelation that shattered everything she thought she knew about her own father. The sealed cell held more than just a body. It held testimony carved in stone by a man left to die for witnessing murder. A journalist named David Chen, her real father. Riverside would never be the same after Maggie Rowe refused to let silence win. Some doors once opened don't just reveal the past, they rewrite the future. And this one would transform a crumbling jailhouse into a monument to truth, proving that justice delayed is not justice denied when someone has the courage to break the chains of collective amnesia. The town had kept its secret for 40 years. It took one woman, $1, and one unbreakable determination to finally set the truth free. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a hollow crack that echoed across the courthouse steps. $1. That's all it took to buy a piece of history that everyone else in town seemed desperate to forget. Margaret Rowe stood alone in the afternoon heat, clutching a receipt that felt more substantial than the amount written on it. Around her, neighbors and longtime residents whispered behind their hands, exchanging glances that ranged from pity to something darker. Concern, maybe? Or warning, you actually bought that place, Mom? Eli's voice broke through her thoughts. Her 15-year-old son leaned against their truck, arms crossed, trying for nonchalance, but not quite hiding the curiosity in his eyes. Everyone at school says it's cursed. Everyone at school also says Mrs. Henderson's cat can predict the weather, Maggie replied, tucking the receipt into her jacket pocket. Buildings aren't cursed, Eli. They're just old and neglected. But even as she said it, Maggie felt the weight of stares on her back. The crowd dispersed quickly after the sale, too quickly, leaving the courthouse steps emptier than they should have been on a Saturday afternoon. No one had congratulated her. No one had even bid against her. The old jailhouse sat 3 blocks from Main Street, close enough to see from the town square, but separated by a row of overgrown lots that made it feel more isolated than it was. Maggie had driven past it 100 times growing up, never giving it much thought. Just another relic of a town that had stopped growing sometime in the 1950s and never quite figured out how to start again. Now, standing in front of it with the key the county clerk had pressed into her hand, Maggie saw it differently. The building was brick, 2 stories tall, with narrow windows covered by rusted iron bars. The wooden door hung crooked on its hinges, weathered gray by decades of rain and sun. Vines climbed up the western wall, their roots working into the mortar between bricks. It looks like something from a horror movie, Eli said. But he was already moving toward the entrance, that teenage blend of skepticism and fascination pulling him forward. Maggie followed, fitting the heavy key into the old lock. It took some jiggling, but eventually the mechanism turned with a grinding protest. The door swung inward, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled of dust and something else. Old wood. Rushed the accumulated scent of abandonment. Inside, afternoon light slanted through the barred windows, illuminating a corridor lined with cell doors. 6 cells in total, three on each side, all standing open except for one at the very end of the hallway. That door was different. Chains wrapped around it, secured with a padlock that looked newer than anything else in the building. Someone had sealed it deliberately, and recently enough that the chains showed no rust. "That's weird," Eli said, voicing what Maggie was thinking. "Why would they chain one cell shut?" Maggie moved down the corridor, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. Debris littered the space, broken glass, scraps of paper, the remnants of what might have been old filing cabinets pushed against one wall. But it was the chained door that drew her attention like a magnet. Up close, she could see that the chains weren't just wrapped around the door handle. They'd been threaded through holes drilled into the doorframe itself, as if whoever sealed it wanted to make absolutely certain it stayed closed. The padlock was modern, maybe 10 or 15 years old at most. "This doesn't make sense," Maggie murmured, running her fingers over the cold metal. "The building's been abandoned since the 70s. Why would someone come back just to chain this door?" "Maybe they left something valuable in there," Eli suggested, peering through the gap between the door and frame. "Can you see anything?" Maggie leaned closer. Through the narrow opening, she could make out a small cell, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet. A metal cot frame against one wall, no mattress. A rust-stained sink in the corner. But it was too dark to see much else, and the angle was wrong to get a clear view of the entire space. "We should get some tools," she said, straightening up. "Maybe a bolt cutter for these chains." "I want to see what's in there, Mom." Eli's voice had changed, taken on a note of unease. He was looking at the wall beside the chained door, his flashlight beam fixed on something carved into the old brick. "What is this?" Maggie moved to where he stood. In the beam of his flashlight, she could see symbols etched deep into the mortar between bricks. Not random scratches or graffiti, but deliberate marks arranged in a careful pattern. A circle with 3 parallel lines extending from it. Below that, a diamond shape with what looked like a star at its center. And beneath those, more symbols she didn't recognize, each one carved with precision and purpose. "I don't know," Maggie admitted, tracing one of the marks with her finger. The grooves were deep, worn smooth as if many hands had touched them over the years. But someone spent a lot of time on these. They explored the rest of the building in silence after that, documenting the decay, making mental lists of what would need to be repaired. But Maggie's thoughts kept returning to that chained door and the symbols carved beside it. This was supposed to be a simple restoration project, a way to give back to the community while keeping herself occupied during the transition back to her hometown. Now, as they locked the jailhouse door behind them and walked back to the truck, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that she'd bought more than just a building. She'd bought a mystery, one that the town had been trying very hard to forget. "Are we really going to restore this place?" Eli asked, as they drove home through streets lined with maple trees, just beginning to turn autumn colors. "Yes," Maggie said, more firmly than she felt. "It's history, Eli. Whatever happened here, whatever those symbols mean, it's part of this town's story. And stories deserve to be told." In her rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of the jailhouse receding behind them, its windows dark and watchful. She thought about the whispers at the auction, the warnings in people's eyes, the way everyone had seemed relieved when she'd made her winning bid. They wanted someone else to deal with it, she realized. They wanted the responsibility transferred, the burden lifted from collective memory onto someone willing or foolish enough to carry it alone. Well, she was willing. And as for foolish, she supposed time would tell. The Riverside diner sat at the intersection of Main Street and Oak, its chrome-sided exterior gleaming in the morning sun like it had every morning since 1952. Maggie chose a booth by the window, spreading out her notebook and the few documents she'd managed to gather from the county records office. The jailhouse had been built in 1901, operational until 1973, then abandoned when the county consolidated its law enforcement into a newer facility 2 towns over. But the records told her nothing about why that particular cell had been sealed, or what the symbols carved into the walls might mean. "Coffee?" The waitress appeared at her elbow, pot already tilting toward Maggie's cup. "Please. And do you know anything about the old jailhouse? The one on... Heard you bought it." The waitress, her name tag read Donna, poured with studied concentration. "Dollar, right? Whole town's talking about it. I'm trying to learn more about its history. The county records are pretty bare." Donna set the pot down, her smile tight. "Probably for good reason. Some things are better left alone, honey. That place has a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" But Donna was already moving away, her attention suddenly fixed on another table across the diner. Maggie watched her go, frustration building. This was the third person who'd deflected her. Questions in as many days. She was stirring sugar into her coffee when a shadow fell across her. "Table, Mrs. Rowe. Thought I might find you here, Sheriff." Walter Briggs looked exactly like what Central Casting would. Send if you ordered small-town sheriff. Silver hair, weathered face, uniform pressed to knife-edge precision. But his eyes were harder than his friendly tone suggested, and he didn't wait for an invitation before sliding into the booth across from her. "I hear you've been asking questions about the jailhouse," he said, still wearing that pleasant smile that didn't quite reach those hard eyes. "Folks are getting concerned." "Concerned about what? Historical research? Concerned about stirring up old troubles? That building's been closed for 40 years for good reason. And what reason is that?" Briggs leaned back, his hand resting on the table between them, fingers drumming a slow rhythm. "This is a quiet town, Mrs. Rowe. We like it that way. When the county closed that jail, they closed a chapter best left closed. Some buildings carry bad memories. Some doors," his drumming stopped, his eyes locking on hers, "are better left shut." "You mean the sealed cell?" Something flickered across his face. "Surprise, maybe, or calculation." "I mean the whole place. Look, I understand you've got plans to fix it up, turn it into some kind of community center or whatever. Fine, but leave certain things alone. For your own good and the good of this town." "That sounds almost like a threat, Sheriff." "It's a warning. Friendly advice from someone who's seen what happens when people go digging in places they don't understand." He stood, adjusting his belt. "Enjoy your coffee, Mrs. Rowe." Maggie watched him leave, her hands clenched around her cup. The diner had gone quiet, she realized. Every conversation had stopped, every eye carefully averted. They'd all been listening. She gathered her things and left money on the table, aware of the whispers starting again as soon as the door closed behind her. The library was her next stop, a small brick building that smelled of old paper and floor polish. She spent 2 hours going through local newspaper archives on microfiche, searching for anything about the jailhouse. She found plenty about its construction, about various arrests and trials over the years, but nothing about its closure or anything unusual in the 1970s. What she did find was a pattern of missing persons reports. 3 people vanished between 1968 and 1972, all adults, all without explanation. The investigation seemed to have gone nowhere. The cases eventually marked cold. Maggie copied down the names. Thomas Hendricks, Sarah Vance, James Morrison. "Finding what you're looking for?" Maggie startled, nearly knocking over the microfiche viewer. A man stood beside her table, mid-50s, expensive suit that looked out of place in this small-town library. His smile was warm, practiced, the kind that probably worked well in boardrooms and country clubs. "Jonas Webb," he said, extending his hand. "I head up web development. Heard you bought the old jailhouse. News travels fast. Small town." He pulled up a chair without asking. "I wanted to introduce myself. My company has been working on several restoration projects around the county. That jailhouse could be quite an asset to the community if handled right. That's my hope. Thing is, these projects take significant capital, more than most people realize. I'd like to help." He pulled out a business card, set it on the table between them. "Web development has funding available for historically significant buildings. We could partner on this, make sure it's done right. That's generous, but I'm not looking for partners. At least think about it. A building like that, it's more than bricks and mortar. It's part of the town's heritage. We need to be careful how we handle it, what stories we tell about it." His smile never wavered, but something in his tone had shifted, taken on an edge. Some stories don't need to be told at all. There it was again. The warning wrapped in friendly concern. Mr. Webb, if there's something about that building people don't want discussed, maybe that's exactly what needs to be brought to light. Webb's smile finally faded. Mrs. Rowe, I'm trying to help you. This town has a long memory. My grandfather was sheriff here in the 60s and 70s. I know its history better than most. Trust me when I say there are good reasons for letting the past stay buried. I'm a historian, Mr. Webb. The past is my profession. He stood, straightening his tie. Then I hope you're prepared for what you might find. History isn't always as noble as we'd like it to be. He tapped his card on the table. My offer stands. When you realize how deep you're getting, give me a call. Maggie watched him leave, her pulse racing. 2 warnings in one day, both from men with authority and influence, both telling her in their different ways to stop looking, which only made her more determined to look harder. Eli found the first major discovery 3 days later, while they were clearing debris from the main corridor. Mom, come here. Maggie dropped the trash bag she'd been filling and hurried to where her son crouched near the sealed cell. He'd moved aside a section of fallen plaster to reveal more of the brick wall. And there, carved into the surface with painstaking detail, was an entire array of symbols. Unlike the few marks she'd noticed on their first visit, these covered a space roughly 3 feet square. Circles, lines, diamonds, stars, and shapes she couldn't identify, all arranged in what looked like deliberate patterns. Some of the symbols repeated, others appeared only once. But the precision of the carving suggested they weren't random graffiti. There's more over here, Eli said, moving his flashlight beam along the wall. And here. They're all around the sealed door. He was right. The symbols formed a kind of frame around the chained cell, marking it as different, significant. Maggie photographed each carving, documenting the patterns, trying to make sense of the arrangement. It's like a code, Eli murmured. Or a map. Or a warning, Maggie added quietly. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening she made a phone call to the university where she'd completed her graduate work. Dr. Harriet Lane answered on the 3rd ring, her voice as sharp and energetic as Maggie remembered. Maggie Rowe! It's been, 5 years? Are you finally ready to finish that dissertation? Not quite. I need your help with something else. Maggie explained about the jailhouse, the symbols, the strange reactions from townspeople. She emailed the photographs while they talked. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Maggie checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Harriet, I'm looking at your photos. Harriet's voice had changed, taken on the focused intensity Maggie remembered from their research sessions. These aren't random, Maggie. These are ritual markings. Ritual? Protective symbols, warding marks, sigils, call them what you want. They show up in folk traditions across cultures. But these particular configurations, another pause. Where did you say this jailhouse was located? Riverside, Indiana. Small town, pretty isolated, and the cell was sealed? Chained from the outside. Someone wanted it to stay closed. No, Maggie. Harriet's tone turned grim. Someone wanted to keep something in, or keep something out. These symbols, they're not decorative. They're functional. Someone was very deliberately marking that space as dangerous, forbidden, or both. A chill ran down Maggie's spine, despite the warm evening. Harriet, this is a jail cell, not a haunted house. There has to be a rational explanation. Rational doesn't mean mundane. People don't carve symbols like these without reason. They certainly don't arrange them in patterns this specific without purpose. The sound of papers rustling came through the phone. I'm coming down there. This is exactly the kind of suppressed local history I've been researching. When can I see the site? You're serious? Maggie, I've spent 10 years documenting how communities use symbol and ritual to bury uncomfortable truths. If half of what you're describing is accurate, that jailhouse is a primary source goldmine. I'll be there this weekend. After they hung up, Maggie returned to the jailhouse. Eli was at a friend's house, and she wanted to look at the symbols again with Harriet's observations in mind. Armed with a better flashlight and her camera, she studied each carving in detail. Harriet was right. They weren't random. Some symbols appeared in sequences, like sentences or instructions. Others seemed to cluster around specific points on the wall, and the more Maggie looked, the more she noticed they all pointed toward or framed the sealed cell door. She knelt beside the chains, examining them again in the harsh beam of her flashlight. The padlock was commercial, nothing special. The chains were heavy-duty but standard hardware store issue. She could cut through them if she wanted to. Should have cut through them already, really. This was her building now. She had every right to open every door in it. So why did the idea make her hands shake? She reached out, letting her fingers rest on the cold metal of the chains. Through the gap in the door, she could see only darkness. But as she knelt there in the silent corridor, she could have sworn she felt a draft coming from inside the cell. Cool air, carrying a scent she couldn't identify. Not decay or mildew, but something else. Something that made her think of old paper and dried flowers and secrets kept too long. Maggie stood abruptly, backing away from the door. This was ridiculous. She was letting Briggs and Webb and all the town's superstitious whispers get to her. It was just a room. Just a space that had been locked up for decades, probably because someone lost the key and it was easier to chain it shut than to deal with it. But even as she told herself that, she knew it wasn't true. People didn't carve protective symbols around a room they'd simply locked because of a lost key. They didn't warn strangers away from buildings with such vehemence over something so mundane. And sheriffs didn't look at you with barely concealed threat in their eyes because you wanted to restore a historic building. No, there was something about that sealed cell that the town wanted to stay hidden. Something that had been deliberately erased from public record, suppressed in local memory, and sealed behind both physical and symbolic barriers. As Maggie locked the jailhouse door behind her and walked to her truck through the gathering dusk, she made a decision. She would open that cell. She would discover what was inside. And whatever the truth was, whatever the town had been hiding for 40 years, she would bring it to light. Behind her, the jailhouse stood silent and dark, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunset like watching eyes. And if Maggie had looked back, she might have seen the shadow that moved past one of those windows, the suggestion of movement where no movement should have been. But she didn't look back. She drove home to her son and her ordinary life, not yet knowing that some doors, once opened, change everything that comes after. Dr. Harriet Lane arrived on Saturday morning in a battered Volvo packed with books, cameras, and recording equipment. She was exactly as Maggie remembered. Wild grey hair pulled into a loose bun, reading glasses perched on top of her head, and an enthusiasm that made her seem 20 years younger than her actual age. "Show me everything," she said, barely pausing for greetings. They spent the morning documenting the symbols, while Eli watched with a mixture of fascination and unease. Harriet photographed each carving from multiple angles, made detailed sketches, and filled 2 notebooks with observations about the patterns and their possible meanings. "These symbols form a sequence," she explained, tracing a line of marks with her finger. "See how they progress from the entrance toward the sealed cell? It's like they're leading somewhere. Or warning people away from something. Which is it?" Maggie asked. "Maybe both." Harriet stood back, studying the overall pattern. "The placement suggests they were carved over time, possibly by different people. But they all focus on that door." She turned to face the chain cell. "We need to open it. I was planning to cut the chains today. Actually, then let's do it." Maggie had brought bolt cutters from home, heavy-duty ones she'd borrowed from a neighbor under the pretense of clearing old fencing. The chains were thick, but the cutters were designed for exactly this kind of work. She positioned the blades around the first link, squeezed hard, and felt the metal begin to give. "Mrs. Rowe, step away from that door." Sheriff Briggs stood in the corridor entrance, one hand resting on his belt near his holstered weapon. His face was flushed, anger barely contained beneath his professional demeanor. "This is my property, Sheriff. This is a crime scene investigation." His eyes moved to Harriet. "And who might you be?" "Dr. Harriet Lane, University Folklore Department." I'm consulting on the historical significance of your trespassing. Both of you leave now. We have every legal right to be here, Maggie said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. I own this building. I can enter it any time I want, and I can bring consultants with me. Briggs moved closer, his shadow falling across them. That cell stays closed. I don't care what you think you own. Some things are locked up for good reason, and I won't have you disturbing them. What reason? Harriet asked, her academic curiosity overriding caution. What's in there that requires chains and symbols and 40 years of secrecy? None of your business, Briggs pointed toward the exit. Get out! If I find you here again trying to open that cell, I'll arrest you for disturbing a crime scene. What crime? Maggie demanded. But Briggs just stared at her, jaw set, until they gathered their equipment and left. That night Maggie couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Briggs' words, crime scene, and the fear she'd seen beneath his anger. Around midnight, she gave up on rest and drove back to the jailhouse. She told herself she just wanted to check the locks, make sure Briggs hadn't done something to bar her access entirely. The building was dark, silent. Maggie used her key to enter, flicked on her flashlight, and started down the familiar corridor. Everything looked exactly as they'd left it. The bolt cutters sat where she'd dropped them. The chains on the sealed cell remained intact. Then she heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Hello? Her voice echoed off the concrete. Who's there? The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in around her, broken only by her own breathing. Maggie swept her flashlight beam across the cells, down the corridor, finding nothing but shadows and decay. She was imagining things. Old buildings made noises. Settling foundations, wind through broken windows, animals in the walls. There was no one here but her. She turned to leave and nearly tripped over something on the floor near the entrance. A piece of paper folded once. She picked it up with trembling fingers and unfolded it in her flashlight beam. The message was brief, written in block letters. Some doors should stay closed. Maggie's hand shook as she stuffed the note in her pocket. Someone had been here. Someone had left this for her. And that meant someone had a key, or knew how to get in, or had been hiding inside when she arrived. She ran for her truck, not looking back, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. Behind her, in the darkness of the jailhouse, she could have sworn she heard those footsteps again, following her to the exit. You need to stop going there alone, Eli said the next morning, after she'd told him about the note. His face was pale, breakfast untouched in front of him. Mom, this is getting dangerous. I know. I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking. Maggie had barely slept, the note now sitting on her kitchen table like an accusation. But I can't just stop. There's something there, Eli. Something important. Something scary, you mean. She couldn't argue with that. Harriet returned that afternoon with news. I've been researching the history of ritual markings in Midwestern communities. The symbols at your jailhouse match patterns I've seen, associated with burial sites and memorial markers. They're not just protective, they're commemorative. Commemorating what? That's what we need to find out. But Maggie, I think that sealed cell isn't hiding treasure or contraband. I think it's hiding a body. The words hung in the air between them. Maggie had suspected something similar, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way that chilled her. We need more information, Harriet continued. Records, documentation, anything that might tell us who was held in that cell and why it was sealed. They returned to the county records office, this time asking specifically for jail ledgers and booking records. The clerk, an older woman Maggie didn't recognize, seemed reluctant, but eventually brought out several dusty volumes from a back storage room. These haven't been requested in decades, she said, setting them on the table with obvious discomfort. Most of them aren't even properly catalogued. Maggie and Harriet worked through the afternoon, paging through cramped handwriting and faded ink. The ledgers detailed arrests, bookings, releases, drunk and disorderly charges, theft, assault, all the petty crimes of small-town life spread across decades. Then Maggie found it. A ledger dated 1972, the last full year the jailhouse had been operational. She ran her finger down the entries, noting the cell assignments for each prisoner. Cell 1, Cell 2, Cell 3. The numbers progressed as expected. Then came an entry where the cell number should have been, but the space was blank. Not empty, erased. She could see the ghost of writing beneath, where someone had scraped away the ink, leaving only an indentation in the paper. "Harriet, look at this." They both examined the entry. The prisoner's name had been similarly erased, along with the charge and booking date. But at the bottom of the page, clear and unmistakable, was a signature. Deputy Michael Rowe, Maggie's father. Her hands went numb. She stared at that signature. Her father's familiar scrawl, dated October 15th, 1972, 3 weeks before he disappeared. 3 weeks before her mother had told 8-year-old Maggie that Daddy had gone away and wouldn't be coming back. "This is it," she whispered. "The sealed cell. My father signed someone into it, and then he vanished," Harriet finished quietly. "Maggie, I think your father knew what was in that cell. I think that's why he disappeared." The implications crashed over her like a wave. All those years, she'd wondered why her father had left, whether he'd abandoned them, whether something terrible had happened. Now she had an answer, or at least the beginning of one. He'd been involved in whatever secret the sealed cell held. "We have to open it," Maggie said, her voice hard with determination. "Not just for the town's history, for my father, for the truth about what happened to him." The threats started in earnest after that. Eli came home from school on Tuesday with a split lip and scraped knuckles. 3 older boys had cornered him in the parking lot, repeating warnings their parents had told them to deliver. "Stay away from the jailhouse. Stop asking questions. Mind your own business." "I didn't tell them anything," Eli said, pressing ice to his lip. "But, Mom, they knew things. They knew about the symbols, about Dr. Lane, about the ledger. Someone's been watching us." That night, Maggie's house was broken into. Nothing was stolen. Her laptop remained on the desk, her purse untouched on the kitchen counter. But her research notes had been torn to pieces, scattered across her home office floor. The photos she'd printed of the symbols were gone, and on her computer screen, someone had left a message. "Leave it alone," she called the police. A deputy came, took a report, dusted for fingerprints that yielded nothing. He suggested she install better locks, maybe get a security system. He didn't mention the jailhouse, but Maggie saw the knowledge in his eyes. He knew what this was about. Everyone did. Jonas Webb appeared at her door the following evening, all charm and concern. "Mrs. Rowe, I heard about the break-in. Terrible business. This town's usually so safe." He stood on her porch, expensive shoes gleaming, hands in his pockets. "I wanted to renew my offer. $10,000 for the jailhouse. 10 times what you paid. You could use that money to relocate somewhere safer, give your son a better situation. We're not leaving. Be reasonable. You've experienced firsthand that some people don't want that building disturbed. Why risk your safety, your son's safety, for a pile of bricks? Because it's not just bricks. It's answers. And I think you know that." Webb's pleasant expression finally cracked, revealing something cold underneath. "My grandfather was sheriff when that jail closed. He made certain decisions to protect this community, decisions that have kept this town peaceful for 40 years. Don't undo his legacy because of some misguided sense of historical curiosity. Your grandfather sealed that cell. He did what was necessary. Just like I'm doing what's necessary now." Webb stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Take the money, Mrs. Rowe. Take it and go. Because if you keep pushing, you won't like what you find. And neither will anyone else in this town. Get off my property." Webb smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're making a mistake. A very dangerous mistake." He turned to leave, then paused. "That break-in. Consider it a warning. Next time, someone might be home when it happens." Maggie slammed the door, her whole body shaking with anger and fear. Eli stood in the hallway behind her, his face white. "Mom, maybe we should—" "No, we're not backing down. We're finishing this." They went at night, all 3 of them, Maggie, Eli, and Harriet. Better to break the law in darkness than wait for another threat, another warning, another chance for someone to stop them. The bolt cutters made quick work of the chains this time. Metal links snapped with sharp cracks that echoed through the empty corridor. When the last chain fell away, Maggie stood facing the door with her heart hammering against her ribs. "Ready?" Harriet asked softly. Maggie nodded. She gripped the door handle, rusty and cold beneath her fingers, and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, decades of neglect making them stiff. But the door opened, swinging inward to reveal the small cell beyond. Harriet's flashlight illuminated what lay inside, and Maggie heard Eli gasp behind her. A skeleton sat slumped against the far wall, still wearing the remnants of clothing now rotted to tatters. The skull tilted forward, empty eye sockets staring at the floor. One arm lay across the lap, the other stretched toward the wall where more symbols had been carved. But these carvings were different. These were words, sentences, a testimony carved into stone by someone who knew they would never leave this cell alive. Harriet read aloud, her voice shaking. "My name is David Chen. I was locked here October 12, 1972, by Sheriff Webb and Deputy Carlyle. I witnessed their crime. They killed Thomas Hendricks, buried him in the woods behind the mill, said I would join him if I spoke. They're sealing this cell. No trial, no justice, just silence." The flashlight beam moved across more carvings, names, dates, details of corruption and murder carved in desperate, painstaking detail. Sarah Vance, drowned but made to look like accident. James Morrison, beaten and dumped on train tracks. All the missing persons Maggie had found in her research, all connected to Sheriff Webb and his deputies. All silenced to protect the town's image, to protect powerful families, to maintain the illusion of peace. "There's more," Eli said quietly. He knelt beside the skeleton, picking up something small and tarnished. A locket, the chain still intact. He opened it carefully, revealing two tiny photographs inside. A woman and a young girl, on the back engraved in delicate script, "To David with love." Margaret and Lily. Maggie's breath caught. Margaret, her mother's name. And Lily, her own nickname as a child. "I don't understand," she whispered, but Harriet did. "David Chen was your father, Maggie. He wasn't Deputy Rowe. He was the prisoner. The one who saw too much and had to be erased." The truth crashed down on her. Her father hadn't disappeared. He'd been murdered, sealed in this cell, and left to die slowly in the dark. And Deputy Michael Rowe, the man whose signature she'd seen in the ledger, he'd been one of the killers. The man she'd called Father, the man who'd raised her for 8 years before vanishing, hadn't been her real father at all. He'd been her mother's second husband, taking the surname Rowe to hide from a past crime. And when guilt or fear had finally driven him away, he'd left behind a daughter who never knew the truth. Maggie sank to her knees beside the skeleton, tears streaming down her face. This was David Chen, her biological father. The man who'd carved these desperate words, who'd tried to leave evidence, who'd held onto a locket bearing her infant photograph as he died alone in this sealed tomb. "We need to call someone," Harriet said gently. "Federal authorities, the media. This is too big for local law enforcement." Maggie nodded, unable to speak. Eli knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder, both of them staring at the remains of a man who died fighting for truth in a town determined to bury it. Outside, dawn was breaking over Riverside, and with it came the moment when everything would finally come to light. Harriet made the first call while they were still in the cell, her voice steady despite the horror they'd uncovered. State police first, then the FBI field office in Indianapolis. By the time the sun had fully risen, the jailhouse was crawling with investigators, photographers, and forensic specialists. Maggie sat on the courthouse steps across the street, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching official vehicles come and go. Eli stayed close beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly. Neither of them had spoken much since leaving the cell. What was there to say? Everything had changed in the span of one night. A forensic anthropologist confirmed what they already knew. The remains were decades old, consistent with death in the early 1970s. The carvings on the walls showed evidence of having been made over an extended period, possibly weeks or months. Cause of death would require further examination, but the evidence pointed to one conclusion. Someone had been locked in that cell and left to die. Dr. Harriet Lane spent hours with the state investigators, showing them her documentation of the symbols, explaining their significance as memorial markers and protective wards. She'd brought copies of the ledger with the erased entry, photographs of every carving both inside and outside the cell, and her research connecting the symbols to burial rituals used by communities trying to honor the dead, while keeping terrible secrets hidden. The townspeople knew, Harriet explained to the lead investigator within Maggie's earshot. Maybe not the specifics, but they knew something terrible had happened in that cell. The symbols were their way of acknowledging the victim while still maintaining the silence that authority demanded. It's a pattern I've seen in other communities, folk memory preserving what official history tries to erase. By noon, Sheriff Briggs appeared at the jailhouse, his face ashen. He tried to enter the building, but state police turned him away. Maggie watched from her vantage point as he stood on the sidewalk, staring at the activity around him, his entire world crumbling. When he finally noticed Maggie watching, he crossed the street toward her with heavy steps. "You should have left it alone," he said, his voice ragged. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've told the truth." Maggie stood to face him, exhausted but unwavering. "Something you should have done 40 years ago. It wasn't that simple. My father, Deputy Carlyle, he was one of Webb's men. I grew up knowing there were things we didn't talk about, things that stayed buried for the good of everyone. When I became sheriff, I swore I'd keep that cell sealed. I thought I was protecting the town, protecting families from shame and scandal. You were protecting murderers." Briggs flinched, as if she'd struck him. "My father's dead. Webb's father is dead. What good does dragging this up do now? You've destroyed this town's reputation, shattered families, turned neighbor against neighbor. And for what? A man who died before you could remember him." "For justice," Maggie said quietly, "and for the truth about who I am. David Chen was my father. He deserves to be remembered. Not erased, not silenced, but honored as someone who tried to stop terrible crimes and paid the ultimate price. Mrs. Rowe, I need you to come with me." A state police detective approached, her badge visible on her belt. "We have some questions about your family history and the man you knew as your father." As Maggie followed the detective away, she heard Briggs behind her, his voice cracking. "I was just trying to keep the peace." The interrogation lasted hours. Maggie told them everything she knew about Michael Rowe, the man who'd raised her until she was 8. How he'd been quiet, often troubled, drinking more as years passed. How he'd disappeared one autumn night, leaving behind only a brief note saying he couldn't stay anymore. How her mother had refused to talk about him afterward, moving them to another state and never returning to Riverside until her death 2 years ago. "Your mother's maiden name was Margaret Chen," the detective said, sliding a document across the table. "She married David Chen in 1964. You were born in 1965. David Chen disappeared from public record in October 1972, the same month he was sealed in that cell. Margaret Chen married Michael Rowe 6 months later, in April 1973. She took his surname and gave it to you as well." "She knew," Maggie whispered. "She knew David was dead. She knew Michael Rowe was involved. We believe your mother was coerced into the marriage. Rowe and his associates couldn't risk her speaking out. By making her complicit, giving her his name and his protection, they ensured her silence." The full picture emerged slowly, pieced together from documents, interviews, and the testimony carved in stone. David Chen had been a journalist for a regional newspaper, investigating rumors of corruption in small Midwestern towns. He'd come to Riverside in 1972, following leads about missing persons and suspicious deaths. He'd witnessed Sheriff Webb and his deputies murdering Thomas Hendricks, a local teacher who'd threatened to report their illegal activities. They'd arrested Chen on false charges, locked him in the cell, and sealed it from the outside. No trial, no record, no justice, just silence. And when Chen's wife came looking for answers, they'd given her a choice: marry one of their own and keep quiet, or join her husband in an unmarked grave. Margaret Chen had chosen survival for herself and her infant daughter, but she'd never forgotten. The symbols carved around the cell hadn't just been carved by David Chen. Some of them, the ones on the exterior walls, had been added later, by townspeople who'd suspected the truth, by Margaret herself, perhaps, on secret visits before she'd fled with young Maggie to start over somewhere far away. The story broke that evening. News vans descended on Riverside like locusts, reporters shouting questions at anyone who'd talk. National media picked it up quickly. Small town's dark secret exposed. Sealed jail cell holds murdered journalist. Cover-up spanning decades finally revealed. Jonas Webb called an emergency town meeting that night at the high school gymnasium. Maggie wasn't sure she had the strength to attend, but Harriet insisted. "This is where you finish it," Harriet said. "Not in a jail cell or an interrogation room, but facing the community that tried to silence you. This is where you speak for your father." The gymnasium was packed. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls. The air thick with tension and whispered conversations that died as soon as Maggie entered. She walked down the center aisle with Eli on one side and Harriet on the other, feeling every eye on her. Jonas Webb stood at the podium, microphone in hand, his expensive suit somehow making him look smaller rather than more authoritative. When he saw Maggie, his face hardened. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his amplified voice echoing through the space. "We're here tonight because of a tragedy. Not the tragedy of what happened 40 years ago, but the tragedy of what's happening now. Our town is being torn apart by an outsider who doesn't understand our history, our values, or our way of life." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Rowe bought a building she had no business buying, started digging into matters she had no right to investigate. And now she's brought shame and scandal down on all of us. Yes, something terrible happened in 1972, but it was dealt with by the authorities of that time. Opening old wounds helps no one. It only causes pain. "It helps the truth," Maggie said, her voice cutting through the gymnasium without need of a microphone. She stood in the aisle, refusing to be cowed. "And it helps the victims who were silenced." "You're not from here," Webb shot back. "You don't understand what I was born here. My father died here. I have every right to speak." Maggie moved forward and the crowd parted before her. David Chen was murdered by men who were supposed to protect this community. He was sealed in a cell and left to die because he witnessed a crime and refused to stay silent. That's not ancient history. That's not a closed matter. That's murder and conspiracy and corruption that infected this town for decades. Your father, the man you call your father, was part of that corruption. Webb's composure finally cracked, his voice rising with desperation. "Michael Rowe was a deputy. He signed the booking ledger. He helped seal that cell. Are you proud of that legacy? Michael Rowe wasn't my father. David Chen was. And I'm proud of him for trying to expose the truth, even though it cost him everything." "This is ridiculous," Webb sputtered. "Sheriff Briggs, tell them how this woman is manufactured." But Briggs wasn't standing with Webb anymore. The sheriff sat in the front row, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. "Sheriff!" Webb's voice took on a note of panic. "Sheriff Briggs, back me up here." Briggs stood slowly, turned to face the crowd. His face was wet with tears, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying in the shocked silence. "It's all true. Everything she's saying. My father was part of it. I've known my whole life, and I've spent my career protecting that secret. I thought I was protecting the town, protecting families, protecting a way of life. But all I was doing was protecting murderers and their legacy." He looked at Maggie, his eyes hollow. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Your father deserved justice, and I helped deny it to him." The gymnasium erupted. Shouts, accusations, people standing and demanding answers. Some directed anger at Webb and Briggs. Others turned on Maggie, blaming her for destroying the town's peace. But through the chaos, Harriet's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "I have documents." She held up a folder thick with papers. Birth records, marriage certificates, newspaper clippings from David Chen's investigation. bank records showing payoffs to Sheriff Webb and his deputies. Everything Mrs. Rowe discovered is corroborated by decades of evidence that's been sitting in public archives. Waiting for someone brave enough to piece it together, she moved to the podium, pushing Webb aside physically when he tried to block her. This town has a choice. You can continue protecting the legacy of corrupt men who murdered innocent people, or you can honor the victims by finally acknowledging what happened. David Chen deserves a memorial. Thomas Hendricks deserves to be found and properly buried. Sarah Vance and James Morrison deserve to have their deaths investigated honestly. My grandfather was a pillar of this community. Webb shouted, grabbing the microphone back. He built half the buildings in this town, employed hundreds of people, donated to every charity and church. You can't erase that legacy because of unproven allegations from... I can prove it. The voice came from the back of the gymnasium. An elderly woman stood, leaning heavily on a walker. My name is Dorothy Hendricks. Thomas was my brother. I've kept his diary for 50 years, afraid to come forward because I was told I'd end up like him if I spoke. But I'm 83 years old now, and I'm not afraid anymore. She made her way slowly down the aisle, and the crowd parted for her as they had for Maggie. When she reached the front, she handed Maggie a worn leather journal. Tom wrote about what he saw. Sheriff Webb and his men running smuggling operations through the county, taking bribes, making people disappear when they asked too many questions. He was going to take it to the state police. They killed him before he could. Her voice grew stronger, decades of fear and silence finally breaking. I want justice for my brother. I want the truth to come out, even if it's 50 years too late. Others stood then. More voices, more stories. A man whose cousin had vanished in 1971. A woman whose father had been run out of town for asking questions. A teenager who'd found strange symbols carved in the woods and been told never to go back there. One by one, the suppressed memories of an entire community began to surface. 3 days later, Maggie organized a public gathering at the jailhouse. Federal investigators had finished their initial documentation, and the sealed cell stood open, its terrible secret now a matter of public record. She'd invited everyone in town, along with media, state officials, and representatives from historical preservation societies. Jonas Webb made one last attempt to stop it. He stood outside the jailhouse with a handful of supporters blocking the entrance. "This is a crime scene," he insisted when Maggie arrived with Eli and Harriet. "You can't turn it into some kind of circus attraction. It's not an attraction. It's a memorial." Maggie faced him calmly. "And you need to move. My family built this town. Your grandfather was a murderer." The words came from Eli, stepping forward to stand beside his mother. "And you've spent your whole life protecting him instead of honoring the people he killed. That legacy ends today." Webb's face purpled with rage, but before he could respond, more townspeople arrived. Not all of them. Riverside remained divided on what Maggie had exposed, but enough. Dorothy Hendricks came with her extended family. Others who'd lost relatives or harbored suspicions came. Even some who'd initially opposed Maggie's investigation now stood with her, their own moral compasses finally pointing toward truth. "Let them through." "Jonas." The mayor appeared, looking haggard but resolute. "It's over. The state's already investigating your family's business dealings. They've found evidence of ongoing corruption, bribes paid to keep your grandfather's name clean. You're done." Webb looked around at the crowd, at the media cameras filming everything, at the federal agents standing nearby ready to intervene. His support had evaporated. He was alone, his family's carefully constructed legacy crumbling in real time. "You've destroyed everything," he said to Maggie, his voice breaking. Was it worth it? Was dragging up the past worth destroying the present? "The present was built on lies," Maggie replied. "And yes, truth is always worth it." Inside the jailhouse, Maggie had prepared a simple display. Photographs of David Chen, Thomas Hendricks, Sarah Vance, and James Morrison. Copies of the symbols and their meanings, explained by Harriet in clear, accessible language. Transcriptions of the testimony David had carved into the cell walls before he died. And in the center, the locket that had survived decades, sealed in darkness. still holding photographs of a wife and daughter David Chen never got to see grow up. Harriet addressed the gathered crowd, her academic expertise giving weight to what might otherwise have seemed like sensationalism. She explained how communities bury trauma, how folk memory preserves what official history erases, how symbols and rituals serve as both memorial and warning. What happened in this cell wasn't supernatural, she concluded. It was human evil, enabled by human silence, perpetuated by human fear. But it's also being corrected by human courage. Margaret Rowe didn't just uncover her father's murder. She gave voice to everyone who's ever been silenced by power, everyone who's ever been erased from history because the truth was inconvenient. Then Sheriff Briggs stood to speak. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago, his uniform rumpled, his hands shaking as he gripped the podium. "I'm here to confess." His voice cracked. "Not just my knowledge of the cover-up, but my active participation in maintaining it. When Mrs. Rowe started asking questions, I threatened her. I tried to intimidate her into silence. I abused my authority to protect a lie because that's what I was raised to do. My father told me that some truths were too dangerous to speak, that protecting the town meant protecting its secrets. But he was wrong, and I was wrong. The truth is never dangerous. Silence is dangerous. Lies are dangerous. Cover-ups are dangerous." He pulled off his badge and set it on the podium. "I'm resigning, effective immediately. I'll cooperate fully with state and federal investigations. And I want to say, Mrs. Rowe, that your father, David Chen, was a hero. He died trying to do what I should have done my whole career, tell the truth, no matter the cost." The gathering lasted for hours. People shared stories, asked questions, wept for losses both old and new. Media filmed it all, ensuring that what happened in Riverside would be documented, studied and remembered as the sun set, casting long shadows across the old jailhouse. Maggie stood in the sealed cell one last time. Eli and Harriet flanked her, the three of them looking at the carvings that had finally been read, the testimony that had finally been heard. "What happens now?" Eli asked. "Now we remember," Maggie said. "We make sure David Chen and the others aren't forgotten. We turn this place into something that teaches people why truth matters, why silence is never neutral, why courage sometimes means standing alone." 6 months later, the restored jailhouse opened as the Riverside Truth and Reconciliation Memorial. Federal grants and private donations had funded the renovation, preserving the building's historical character while transforming it into a functional museum and education center. The sealed cell remained largely unchanged, its carvings protected behind climate-controlled glass. Visitors could see exactly what David Chen had written, read his testimony in his own hand. Adjacent rooms displayed the broader context, information about the other victims, documentation of the corruption that had infected the town, and exhibits about how communities grapple with uncomfortable histories. Jonas Webb was under federal indictment for bribery, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. The investigation into his family's business dealings had revealed decades of illegal activities, all designed to protect the Webb name and maintain their control over the town. His assets were frozen, his influence gone, his legacy reduced to cautionary tale. Sheriff Briggs had resigned as promised. He'd given extensive interviews to investigators, provided documents and recordings he'd kept hidden for years, and testified before a grand jury. He wouldn't face criminal charges. The statute of limitations had expired, but he'd lost everything that mattered to him: his career, his reputation, and his place in the community he'd tried so hard to protect. Dorothy Hendricks had led investigators to a location in the woods behind the old mill, where ground-penetrating radar found what her brother's diary had described. Thomas Hendricks was finally given a proper burial, with half the town attending the funeral. Sarah Vance's death was reclassified from accidental drowning to suspicious circumstances. Her case reopened. James Morrison's family received official acknowledgement of what had happened to him, along with a formal apology from the state. David Chen was buried in Riverside Cemetery beside Margaret Chen, who died 2 years earlier, never telling her daughter the full truth of what had happened. Maggie stood at the grave on a cold November morning, reading the inscription she'd chosen. David Chen, 1940-1972, journalist, father, truth-teller. He gave his life rather than remain silent. "I wish I'd known you," she said quietly to the headstone. "I wish I'd had the chance to hear your voice, to know your stories, to understand who you were beyond these terrible final weeks. But I promise you, Dad, that what you started, I've finished. The truth is out. The silence is broken. You didn't die in vain." Eli stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. In the months since the sealed cell was opened, he'd matured in ways that broke Maggie's heart, even as they made her proud. He'd faced down bullies and threats, stood by his mother when others pressured him to abandon her, and discovered a passion for justice that reminded her so much of the father he'd never met. "I've been thinking," Eli said as they walked back to the car, "about college. There's a program at Dr. Lane's university, journalism and history combined. I think that's what I want to study. Investigative reporting, uncovering stories that powerful people try to bury." Maggie pulled him into a hug, tears streaming down her face. "Your grandfather would be so proud." The memorial opened officially the following week. The mayor gave a speech about healing and moving forward. Harriet presented the academic research she'd compiled, which was already being used in university courses about folk memory and historical trauma. Reporters from national outlets covered the event, ensuring that Riverside's story would reach beyond small-town boundaries. But the moment Maggie remembered most vividly came during the private preview, when she stood in the main corridor with Eli and looked at the installation they'd created. The symbols that had covered the walls were now explained with detailed placards. The cells had been restored, with exhibits in each one telling different aspects of the story. And at the end of the corridor, where the sealed cell stood open for the first time in 40 years, light streamed through a new window they'd installed. Light. Where there had been only darkness, truth. Where there had been only silence. Memory where there had been only erasure. "You know what the hardest part is?" Maggie said to Harriet that evening, after the ceremonies had concluded and the crowds had dispersed. They sat on the courthouse steps across from the memorial, watching the last visitors leave, knowing that the town wanted to forget. Not just the guilty ones, but ordinary people who found it easier to pretend nothing had happened than to confront an uncomfortable truth. That's what really kept the secret for 40 years, not chains or threats, but collective amnesia. "That's why this matters," Harriet replied. "You didn't just solve a mystery. You demonstrated that truth has value even when it's painful, that justice delayed isn't justice denied if someone's willing to fight for it, and that ordinary people can stand against powerful systems when they find the courage to speak. I'm writing a book," Eli announced, joining them on the steps, "about everything that happened. Not just the investigation, but what it means. How silence perpetuates injustice. How communities can heal by facing their past instead of hiding from it. Dr. Lane says she'll help me." "Of course I will," Harriet said, smiling. "Though I suspect you'll end up teaching me as much as I teach you." As darkness fell over Riverside, lights came on in the memorial building. Maggie had insisted on leaving it illuminated at night, a beacon visible from every part of town. Some residents complained about the reminder. Others had grown to appreciate it. But everyone who passed by knew what it represented. Or that should never have been sealed, a truth that should never have been hidden. Man who died rather than surrender his voice, and a daughter who refused to let his silence be the final word. Maggie stood, stretched, and took one last look at the building that had changed everything. The jailhouse that she'd bought for $1 had cost her so much more. Her sense of safety, her illusions about the man who'd raised her, her naive belief that her hometown was a simple, innocent place. But it had given her something infinitely more valuable, the truth about who she was, who her father had been, and what it meant to honor his legacy by finishing what he'd started. "Ready to go home?" Eli asked. "Yeah," Maggie said. "I'm ready, but as they walked to the truck, she looked back one more time. The memorial stood illuminated against the night sky, its windows glowing with warm light. Inside those walls, David Chen's story would be told and retold, generation after generation, a testament to the power of truth and the courage it takes to speak it. Some doors, once opened, change everything that comes after. This one had changed a town, a family, and the course of history itself, and Maggie knew, with absolute certainty, that opening it had been worth everything it cost. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.